The Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague.
Welcome to the Books Podcast. I'm Tim Hague. Now, you might have noticed that one of our interests is economics and economic history, and we've been very happy to talk to the likes of Nicholas Wapshott, George Cooper, Nick Wallis. Those interviews are still here, in case you want to revisit them. A new book called Capitalism and Its Critics caught my eye this month, and we are delighted to welcome its author, John Cassidy, to the show.
If you want to just go back to the sort of basic mechanics of how capitalism works, or Marx, not that Marxism, but the original stuff is actually very useful. It was decided that the British East India Company at the time was too big to fail and it got bailed out. So that just shows you that, another issue which we think is very modern actually goes back.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
John, thank you for joining us on Books Podcast.
Thanks very much for inviting me on.
Now, you're not necessarily taking up arms against capitalism, are you? I mean, the subtitle of the book is A Battle of Ideas in the Modern World. And this book is a way of, considering the history rather than just assaulting it, rather than a frontal assault.
Yeah, it's more a description and a history than a sort of tract. I mean, I think my opinions probably come through in it, but it's meant to be a history giving a fair voice to everybody I write about.
Well, I think you do, and there are a lot. I mean, there are some you weren't able even to get to,
right?
But then there's quite a lot to say, and it's quite a heavyweight, dense book as it is. Very readable, though, very enjoyable. The first thing that strikes you from this history is that capitalism is an absolute juggernaut, isn't it? It's fantastically impervious to criticism.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things which has struck me, actually, with the publication. Some of the initial reviews are from conservative publications saying, this book, it shows how durable and triumphant capitalism is, which certainly wasn't my intention in writing it. But, of course, it's true that capitalism, industrial capitalism I'm referring to, because there were previous versions, has been going about 250 years and, it's still going strong and doesn't seem to be a replacement on the horizon, that's for sure.
And it does seem to be, charging all before it. Now, of course, when we say capitalism, you've actually prefaced that there because we all think we know what it is. Right. But as the book shows, capitalism is protean. It changes. It has different faces. So it might not be a bad idea to define it. Would you mind?
Yeah, sure. I mean, capitalism, in terms of people think of it just in terms of the profit motive and people trying to make money, that obviously goes back forever. It's as old as human society. The Greeks criticized the sort of capitalist Jesus trying to run the moneylenders out of the temple. So that's a form of capitalism. This book doesn't go that far. I'm really talking about industrial capitalism.
Well, you go back to mercantilist
and
capitalism.
mercantilism before that.
What's that? What's the difference?
Well, mercantile capitalism was the capitalism which Adam Smith wrote about, and that was basically colonial capitalism based on trade with places like India, the US, which was a British colony at the time. It was a rivalrous system with rival empires like the British, the French, and the Dutch, who had far-flung empires. Big companies like the East India Company, the Dutch East India Company. It was a form of capitalism. The British East India Company had a headquarters in the city of London, much as many modern companies have a headquarters there. But it wasn't industrial capitalism.
But it was exploitative. That's the central fact of capitalism.
Of course, it was a colonial base. The slave trade was part of mercantile capitalism too. It was extremely exploitative and global. So that's one of the points I make in the book, that even though industrial capitalism we think of as something completely new, it shares some traits with the previously existing capitalism. So you're right, it's a very protean system and it's changed a lot over the centuries, but there are some common threads which I hope give the book a sort of a constant thesis to run through and keep the readers engaged.
You mentioned Adam Smith. Most of us don't think of him especially as a critic of capitalism. I mean, he's the patron saint of laissez-faire.
Right, yeah, I know. I'm a former Washington correspondent for the Sunday Times of London when I was a young man. And when that was back in the 80s and early 90s, and all the conservatives in those days used to wear in Washington Adam Smith badges, because the Adam Smith Society was the sort of place you joined if you're an ambitious young Republican. You're right. But Adam Smith, if you go back and actually read him, which I did, he actually wrote The Wealth of Nations as a criticism of mercantile capitalism. And the aspects of it that he criticized were protectionism. He didn't believe mercantile capitalism had large tariffs, much like Donald Trump's trying to impose today. It also had monopolies like the East India Company. Adam Smith was a big critic of monopolies. He believed in competition, not monopolistic capitalism. And he actually wrote in his book, he was very suspicious of individual businessmen. He said if more than 2 or 3 of them gather in any one place, conversation will very quickly turn to how to raise prices, and exploit the consumers. So Adam Smith was a big apostle of competitive capitalism, competition, small-scale production, things like he has famous quotes about how you depend on the butcher and the candlestick maker and all the tradesmen. It was tradesman's-based capital he liked. He would have hated the modern, Goliath-sized companies, the Silicon Valley companies, etc., the big oil companies. So why is he in a book critical of capitalism, a book called Capitalism His Critics? Because he was a critic of the capitalism of his day.
Was his faith in the free market, was it justified at all? I mean, it was based on a conviction that it led to high incomes and high wages. Whereas, I think we more recently expect that the idea of capitalism is to suppress wages if possible.
I mean, capitalism is a paradoxical system, which is one of the reasons why it survived so long. I mean, if you just look at it over the centuries, it has been associated with a large increase in living standards and wages. There's and GDP. There's only a couple of charts in the book. One of them shows a chart of GDP going back to the year dot. And basically for the first 3,000 or 4,000 years, it runs flat, completely flat. And then about 1800, when the Industrial Revolution it starts turning up and then goes straight up like a hockey stick. So if you look at it, over the centuries, capitalism has been a uniquely productive system and has produced a massive increase in living standards throughout the advanced world. For a long time, the developing world was left out. That's starting to change a bit with India and China. But so that's always the great defense of capitalism, that in the long term, it delivers the bacon more effectively than other systems. But does that mean it's not exploitative or it doesn't put downward pressure on wages? No. In the short term, that's very much what happens. In fact, in the early Industrial Revolution, there was very little increase in wages at all for about 50 years, which I cover. And there was a lot of technological displacement. There was the Luddite movement. There was a rise of trade unions. It was very exploitative. Most of the people who worked in factories, people don't realize this in places like Manchester and Leeds, where I'm from, the big factories were largely staffed by women and children because they were cheaper and easier to boss around. So, as I said, it's a sort of Janus-faced system, capitalism.
Well, you quote Marx as saying that the enemy wasn't technology itself, but the system in which it used. Marx was quite keen on technology to reduce the drudgery of the ordinary people, and of course you have a significant chapter on Karl Marx. Is it not? This is what I think about Marx. Is it not rather adroit of the apologists for capitalism to position Marx as a prophet of communism rather than as a critic of capitalism? Sure. Because he got things wrong in his analysis of the exploitation was bang on the nail.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. I was brought up in the British Keynesian tradition. I went to Oxford and studied economics under Keynesian economists who basically had no time for Marx and that sort of tradition at all. Because they assumed that as long as you had high aggregate demand, wages would go up, which is what happened for 30 years after the Second World War. Then that suddenly stopped, and people started to take a more critical view of the system. And when you had globalization, you basically had global capitalism undercutting wages. Then a lot of the sort of Marxian insights came back. So the way I present Marx is exactly, actually, as you said, as a sort of engine of analysis. If you want to analyze global capitalism, I think a very good place to start is, paradoxically, the Communist Manifesto of 1848, which is really the first description of global capitalism. And even though it's got very famous ringing phrases about communism, first half of it is actually a very perceptive analysis of the productiveness of capitalism. Marx talks about how capitalists have achieved things which the ancient pharaohs could never achieve. So, as you said, he completely saw the immense sort of technological power and economic power of the system, but he was very critical of how it was applied, and how he basically didn't think it could be reformed in any way to benefit the masses. the original theory of capitalism, it's gone through many iterations, but the original theory is basically a theory of immiseration, because most people don't get any benefit out of it whatsoever. They get immiserated, i.e. they're poor and starving. Eventually they won't put up with that, and there'll be a revolution. That's the Marxist theory of history. People have sort of tried to redo it in terms of profit crises and all sorts of other things, but if you actually read Marx in the original, what he's saying is, as he says in the Communist Manifesto, him and Engels, the system produces its own gravediggers, the proletariat, the working class. And I think that obviously got falsified by history, apart from in Russia, because actually wages did and living standards did go up over the subsequent century. Now, we can discuss why that happened. But again, if you want to just go back to the sort of basic mechanics of how capitalism works and what the underlying tendencies are, I think Marxism, or Marx, not that Marxism is all sorts of different things, but the original stuff is actually very useful. And that's been a sort of evolution in my thinking, because I say I just started off as a standard Keynesian. And Keynesianism, if you believe in it, you don't really have to look under the hood. You just sort of, as long as aggregate demand is kept up and we have full employment, pretty much everything's tickety-boo. That was the original sort of hydraulic Keynesian theory.
Well, in the same way as Adam Smith, it's impossible to ignore Keynes.
Right.
But again, how far can we regard him as a critic of capitalism? He on the whole, wanted just to manage it.
Keynes is a liberal, of course, so he believed in the free market as a sort of expression, or the best way to guarantee individual liberty, as he saw it. It was basically a sort of Edwardian liberal. So he was a defender of capitalism, and of course he used to invest in it. He invested his own money. He invested the funds of his college in Cambridge. He was a very successful trader, although he did have some setbacks like all traders do. But he thought capitalism had one fatal flaw, which is that it gets stuck in recessions and it can't get out of them. And eventually that will...
He had a point, too.
Well, he was writing during the Great Depression, of course. And the 1920s were very, they were big. It was the British economy was basically trapped in permanent recession in the 20s and 30s. So he was a critic of the system in the sense that he thought it had a huge defect that needed reforming. But you're right. He saw himself as basically saving the system rather than replacing it. He certainly didn't have any faith in communism. Now, I mean, of course, at the time, a lot of his students in Cambridge in the 1930s were joining the Communist Party. So in a sense, Keynes was trying to provide them with a vision which didn't lead them in the direction of the sort of supporting the Soviets.
So a friendly critic, rather.
Yeah, no, he was definitely... I mean, as I said, the book is not... if you're writing a history of capitalism, there are certain figures you have to deal with, I think. Adam Smith is one, Keynes is another, and then the modern sort of neoliberals like Milton Friedman and Hayek. Now, they were all sort of critics of the capitalism of their day. They weren't trying to overthrow the system. In fact, one of my American interlocutors, Jared Bernstein, who used to work at the White House he was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. I did an event with him in Washington. He had a very useful distinction, I think, with this book, which I give. If I'd have realized it myself, I would have put it in the introduction, but it's really Jared's. He said that there are two types of critics in this book. There are critics who are critics of baseball, or we could do cricket in England, say, critics of baseball, and there are some of them who are critics of zoos. Now, critics of baseball, they love the sport, but they think it's gone wrong somewhere. They think it takes too long, there's too much money, the rules have been changed too much, whatever. Then there are critics of zoos who think they're just irredeemably cruel and, shouldn't be allowed to exist because keeping animals in captivity is inherently wrong. So this book has both critics of zoos and critics of baseball in it. And that's how it's constructed. I think you have to have both in there if you're going to tell the whole story.
You quote Michael Kalecki, another economist, again with reference to Keynesianism, as arguing that unemployment is natural and necessary to capitalism. He said that business leaders would turn against Keynesianism because the goal of full employment undermines their power over their workers.
Well, I mean, again, that's another insight, I think, which a lot of people, including myself, didn't fully appreciate back in the 70s and 80s. And again, that actually goes back to Marx and the reserve army of labor. Marx and Engels, they thought the system needed a certain level of unemployment to keep the workers pliant and keep wages under control. Keynesianism took the opposite view in the post-war era. The great if you go back and read Beveridge and Keynes himself, the great aim is full employment, and then wages will rise. And that certainly happened. Now, Kalecki, who knew Keynes in the 30s, brilliant Polish economist, he was a supporter of Keynesianism to a point, but he thought it had this fatal flaw that eventually it would fall foul on a sort of political economy basis, that the business community would turn against it because wages would rise and profits would fall. So even though it could work in the short term, in the long term, it's sort of Marxian thing, it has inherent internal contradictions which would come to the fore. And when he wrote that in the 1940s, it was sort of way ahead of his time, and it got ignored at the time. But 30 years later, in the 1970s, when there was a sort of profit squeeze and businesses had turned against Keynesianism, it turned out to be very prophetic.
You also reference Karl Polanyi, the Hungarian economist, first half of the 20th century, who argues a bit in the same way as Friedrich von Hayek, that it's democracy that's the danger, and that democracy will lead you, in one case, either to socialism or to fascism. Right. And the way to preserve capitalism is to undermine democracy. Well, a very Trumpian outlook.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Polanyi was a Democrat. He was a socialist Democrat. He grew up in Hungary and then moved to Austria in the 1920s, lived in what they call Red Vienna, which is a great socialist experiment in the 1920s and very successful in its own right. But then had to flee when the Nazis took over Germany. So he had a very dark view, given his background, and some of his family members died in the Holocaust. He had a very dark view of sort of capitalism and democracy. And he basically, his analysis was actually based on Britain in the 19th century, but he basically argued that the great defenders of capitalism always, like Keynes, for example, or Adam Smith, saw it as a way of preserving liberty and not so much democracy. Smith it wasn't democracy in the 18th century. It was basically oligarchy and only a very limited franchise. But people like Keynes and most liberals in the 20th century thought capitalism and democracy went together, hand in fist. But Polanyi took the opposite point of view. He argued that capitalism and democracy in long term were completely inconsistent, and the only they produced again internal tensions and couldn't be contained. The only sustainable system were the extremes: fascism on the right, which he'd witnessed, or socialism, which he supported. And again, he wrote this in the 1930s during the Great Depression, and he sort of reiterated in his famous book in the 1940s. And he got in the Keynesian post-war era, those ideas got forgotten really, because it seemed capitalism and democracy were working very well together. But again, once everything went to hell in the 80s and 90s, and especially more recently with the rise of sort of right-wing populism and authoritarianism, and the Trumpian view of the world. Polanyi, again, is another person who seems to be a prophet.
This is an aside, but when you talk about economists having to, flee, and we live in a world where being an economist is a fairly peaceful trade, but there are several of your subjects came very sticky. Rosa Luxemburg was murdered by the rightists in Austria after the First World War, right. And Nikolai Kondratiev, one of Stalin's victims, and Walter Rodney was murdered by the state in Guyana as recently as 1980. Yeah. We don't think of that as a sort of...
No, I did try to pick people in the book who led interesting lives. I didn't want it to be a book about, just people who sit in...
And one of the things you do is adumbrate people's lives. Yeah. You get little potted histories as well.
The way the book is structured is as a history of capitalism told through the eyes of its critics. So it's each chapter is a different biography, really. And I use that as a sort of vehicle for exploring the idea.
But it has to be, because capitalism is dynamic. It's not. Exactly. It's not just it's not like a system that you can abstractly critique.
No, exactly.
So people are
exactly. Each of the critics are reacting to the circumstances of their time. And as you said, they they run the gamut. And there are some full-on revolutionaries in the book, including Rosa Luxemburg, who's a fascinating figure, who was another brilliant young woman, Polish, who then moved to Germany. The German Socialist Party at the time was nominally Marxist, the SPD it's called now. at that time its sort of ruling ideology was Marxist, and she was a Marxist theoretician. She actually criticised Marx on economic grounds. She took on his book Capital and said it's got a fatal flaw, which we can get into if you want, but whatever. It made her very unpopular with some of the sort of higher ups in the German Socialist Party. But she stayed in it. She eventually broke with it and joined a more radical Communist Party and took part after Germany lost the war in 1918. Everything went to hell. The cities were in uproar, and in Berlin and a couple of other cities, there was actually a sort of attempt at a communist rising, the Spartacist rising. She actually thought that was premature, but she decided to join it and support it and wrote for the newspaper. She thought it was tactically premature. And of course, what happened is the socialist government called in the Free Corps, the sort of precursors of the Nazis, to put down the rising, and she got shot in the head by a sort of right-wing member of the Free Corps, sort of right-wing militias. So, yeah, it was a tragic end. Kondratiev, who you mentioned, was a Russian economist who, again, took part in the revolution. He wasn't a member of the Bolsheviks. He was a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, the SRs, as they were called. And he basically favoured a mixed economy with sort of some role for capitalist enterprises, some role for state enterprises. And that made him unpopular with the Bolsheviks. And he also had this theory of long waves, that capitalism, right in the Marxist theory, there's only one wave. Capital goes up, then it falls down, then it gets overthrown. It's a single wave. Kondratiev came up with the theory of long waves, that actually there were these sort of 50-year cycles of capitalism. So just as you thought it was collapsing, it sort of rose phoenix-like in another wave. Again, that made him even more unpopular with the Bolsheviks. And when Stalin took over, any sort of heretical views obviously was quashed. He got sent to the Gulag, and eventually, when he'd served his time, they tried him again and shot him.
It wasn't hard to be unpopular with Stalin, though, was it?
Well, I mean, I think he was very brave. He could have at any time tried to. He didn't. He could have at any time changed his theory and disassociated himself from it. He never did that. He stuck to his guns to the end, and it cost him his life.
And was murdered, yes.
He was murdered, yes.
One of the themes that you've sort of touched on, and which it's very much one of the themes that emerges from the book, is how many of the criticisms have resonance today. You mentioned the East India Company earlier on. William Bolt was a trenchant critic. In fact, that's if your first chapter is about William Bolt. But the idea of a company that was too big to fail and the state had to come and bail it out goes back even before the beginning of proper capitalism.
Yeah, no, I mean, that goes back to how the book came about, really. I originally got the idea for writing the book in 2016. I live in the US forever, despite my accent. And at that time, Bernie Sanders was running with a critique of capitalism from the left, and Donald Trump was running with a critique of the sort of globalization capitalism from the right. And it seemed to me at that stage that this wasn't a one-off. A lot of American journalists were just writing it off as sort of, a product of the internet or whatever. But it seemed to me there was actually a sort of crisis of legitimacy for the system here, because it was getting attacked from both sides, which really that hadn't happened since the 1930s. And I thought I'm going to write a book about how this came about. But then I had to put it off in the first 4 years of Trump because I was a journalist and I had to cover him and there was no time to do anything else. But then when Trump was voted out in 2020, I thought I've got to get back to the book and do it. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized that the sort of big issues which had sort of undermined the economy in the teens since 2000, things like globalization, pressure on wages, financial crises, inequality, exploitative monopolies, climate change or pollution. These are issues which actually you can't just say, well, that started in 2000, so the book should start there. They actually go back to the very genesis of the Industrial Revolution. So I thought to myself, oh my God, I have to write the whole thing. How am I going to do that? And the way I came up with doing it was by doing it on a biographical basis, starting with, as you say, William Boltz, who was a whistleblower at the East India Company. And to get back to your question, sorry for a long-winded answer, the East India Company, even though it was very large and very profitable, occasionally got into big financial trouble because it had to finance its own army in India. It was basically a sort of state within a company.
But also there was greed on the part of the investors.
And there was massive greed as well.
They abstracted too many profits.
Well, exactly. They basically paid huge dividends to their shareholders, many of whom were in Parliament because it was an It was part of the British ruling. It was an arm of the British ruling class, the East India Company. Lots of young aristocrats used to go there because under the primogeniture system, if you're not the oldest brother, you're screwed. You didn't inherit anything. So, if you're the Duke of Norfolk's eldest son, you're quids in. But if you're his youngest son, you're pretty much on your own. So all the minor aristocrats, or the younger brothers of the major aristocrats, lots of them went to places like the East India Company because they knew if they spent 10 years out there, they could make so much money. They could then come back and live a life of luxury. They were known as the nabobs of the time. And lots of the English country houses actually were built by veterans of the East India Company. Now, William Boltz was one of those himself. He was a sort of self-made Dutchman, actually, who spoke lots of different languages, including English. And he joined the company. He was doing very well for himself in India, making a fortune, because they used to trade for the company, but they were also allowed to trade on their own behalf. Well, that's how they made most of their money. It was sort of, here's £5 for the company and here's £20 for myself. And he got cracked down. He went too far and got cracked down and got fired and got sent back to England. And he was furious about that, so he decided to write a tell-all about how the company really worked. And he happened to put that out at the same time when the company had got into so much trouble it had to apply to Westminster for a bailout. So this book, which in normal course of affairs might have been pretty obscure, turned into a sort of talk of London. It was extracted by the major magazines of the day and became a big uproar. But that didn't stop the government bailing out the East India Company, just as it was very, as you say, it's very present-day based, just as in 2008, the British government had to bail out Northern Rock and NatWest, etc., the Royal Bank of Scotland, as it was then called, and the Americans had to bail out all the banking system. It was decided that the British East India Company at the time was too big to fail, and it got bailed out. So that just shows you that, another issue which we think is very modern actually goes back and is inherent. What it is illustrative of is the close links between the sort of heights of capitalism and the government. There's always been this sort of, the Adam Smith supporters have always sort of made the argument, you have the economy on one side and it's going all along tickety-boo, and you have the government and they're sort of separate entities. The government sort of interferes and screws things up. But actually, that's not how the system has worked. The system has always evolved hand in glove. Government is an essential support mechanism in all sorts of ways for capitalism. In fact, it's a precondition because you need a strong government to guarantee property rights, and you need a strong government to enforce sort of market mechanisms, which we saw under Mrs. Thatcher, for example. So the book that's another one of the themes running through the book, the sort of interplay between government and capitalism all along. It's not, you can't write the history of capitalism by itself, just as you can't write the history of government by itself. They're basically two arms of the same body.
I want to do another one before we move on to that point, to that thought. Thorsten Veblen, an economist writing in America at the end of the 19th century, there was already an idea of a sort of economic man, the Alfred Marshall notion of consumers and businesses maximizing their utility, always making rational choices. Right. But even at the end of the 19th century, Veblen's figured out that people, I think he says, they're not atomistic and entirely rational decision makers. And it's almost as though he's looking forward to a present day when we're beginning to get a kind of, I don't know what the technical term for it is.
Behavioural economics.
Is it behavioural? That's the term I would have used for it.
Veblen was the first.
Studying what people actually do rather than what they're supposed to do.
Right. Veblen was the first behavioural economist. I don't know if it was the first, one of the first, certainly the most famous of his time. And although that term didn't come into, I don't know, I think it's a product of the 90s, basically, that term. And people like Danny Kahneman, who applied psychology to economics. But Veblen himself was an incredible character. He was a farm boy from Minnesota. His family were Norwegian, and they spoke Norwegian in his home, but he also spoke English, of course. And then he went farm boy, he went to Princeton, he went to Cornell. He was always a brilliant student, but at one point he just went back and sort of lolled on his farm for a few years, and his brother said he was basically just a layabout. And they forced him to go back and get another degree. And so he eventually became an academic. But he was always a sort of outsider and a skeptic of established theories. And as you say, in the late 19th century, the sort of Marshallian sort of economic orthodoxy, which still dominates the textbooks of economics, was just being sort of codified and written. And Veblen had no time for any of that. So he spent his life as a sort of bit of a gadfly. I guess he he did get another job at Stanford, but it didn't last long. He was also a philanderer, so he got into trouble wherever he went. But he, as you said, he's known for the theory of conspicuous consumption mostly. That in his day there were a lot of very, very rich people, as there are today.
The Gilded Age.
The Gilded Age, the first Gilded Age, as they say. And they all built huge mansions on Fifth Avenue and huge mansions in Rhode Island on the coast, etc.
Or tried to colonize Mars.
Yeah, it was the same thing.
Nothing's changed.
Nothing. Yeah, exactly. Well, we live in the second Gilded Age.
Yeah,
and he was very critical of that. So even though he's best known for his theory of conspicuous consumption, what I focus on in the book is more his theory of business enterprise. And he basically had a theory that there are productive businessmen who he called the engineering class, basically, who were like
who actually make things.
They make things, exactly. The people who walked on the shop floor and made things, and the pecuniary class of businessmen who were the sort of robber barons who owned many businesses, or the Wall Street financiers who made money by issuing stocks and shares.
Today they're the asset managers.
Exactly, yes. And he was very critical. He basically saw those as a parasitic class. So again,
which they are.
So they're again, very, very prophetic, and in arguments that still resonate today.
One more, J.C. Kumarappa, who was if it's not too reductive, he was Mahatma Gandhi's economist.
Yeah.
Is he due for a revival? He had this idea of sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying. As I was writing this, as I said earlier, I think you had to write about sort of some famous people because obviously they played a big role in the evolution of capitalism. But I also wanted to get some lesser-known people who I think made interesting and significant contributions. And one of the people I picked on was J.C. Kumarappa, who started out as an accountant, actually, an accountant and economist, and actually trained in London as an accountant, and then went to New York and did a master's degree there, and then went back to Bombay as it was at the time, and worked in an accounting firm. One day he got a call from Mahatma Gandhi. This is in 1920s. India was still under British rule. And Gandhi asked him to come and see him at his ashram in central India. And that was because he'd read somebody had passed along the thesis he'd done in New York, which was an analysis of sort of British rule in India and how the British were extracting money from India and basically oppressing the place. Gandhi liked that idea. Obviously, he was part of the Congress Party, the leader of the Congress Party at the time. So he got Kumarappa to come and see him. And Kumarappa was overwhelmed and actually gave up his job and became sort of a chief economic advisor, I guess you'd call it, to Gandhi, and ran some of his newspapers when he was in jail, etc. So that was all. It's a fascinating biography. But he also started to write about economics. And at the time in India, there was a big division. People knew it was going to become independent. The decolonization was widely seen as inevitable. This is in the 20s and 30s. So what was the Indian economy going to be like? There were two views. Most of the Congress Party and Nehru, who succeeded Gandhi, were very enamored by the Soviet model of large-scale industrialization, 5-year plans, etc. And that's the way India actually went. But Kumarappa had a very different view of a sort of locally based economy based on the ancient Indian villages, craftwork production, artisanal production. He thought that was much more humane. He thought large-scale capitalism was dehumanizing, much like Marx did. And he laid out this rival vision of sort of sustainable, local-based economics, which would be much friendlier to the environment, but he also thought would make people happier. Much like Veblen.
And might also abstract it from the world capitalist system, which exploits colonial
well, he was very critical of global capitalism. So he thought it would provide a sort of self-sufficiency for India, keep it outside the global capitalist system, and provide a sort of rival.
He's got to be due for a revival.
No, he is. Well, he's now been starting to be picked up. Hopefully, I'll help it as a sort of prophet of sustainability and sort of local artisanal production. I see him as sort of prophet of the degrowth movement, which is obviously big growing in popularity, especially among young people. Artisanal production, rejection of things like fast fashion. Very skeptical about globalization and sort of large-scale production. Kumarappa was very much in that tradition, and in India, in the 1920s and 30s. So I think he is a fascinating character.
I want to mention the ideology of capitalism. You have a chapter on Thomas Piketty, of course, the French economist who recently had an enormous success with a book called Capitalism in the 20th Century, which was very dense and very long and sold extremely well. I'm not sure how many people read it all. But then he followed that up with a book called Capital and Ideology, which was even longer, but I thought more accessible.
Right.
Swings and roundabouts. But it's this notion that, and it's one of the things that Piketty is getting at is that capitalism is not value free, and need not be the way it is. It's all a question of being manipulated, supported, and driven.
Right. No, very true. I mean, I think Piketty. The reason I wrote about Piketty was mainly for his original contribution, which I think was an empirical one. Just people had said, "Oh, inequality is rising. The rich are getting richer," but him and his colleagues. It wasn't just him. Tony Atkinson, the late Oxford economist, and some French economists like Emmanuel Saez. They set up a huge data project for all the advanced countries. It now covers all the World Inequality Database. And they came up with these charts showing how there used to be all these sort of abstract measurements of inequality, the Gini coefficient, the Lorenz coefficient, which I studied in college, but I'd find it difficult to explain in a couple of sentences here. Whereas the share of the income or wealth that's going to the top 1% or the top 0.1%, anybody can grasp that. In America now, the top 0.1% control, sort of 50% of the wealth or something. And don't quote me on that exact figure, but the top 1%, I think, controls 50% of wealth. So that's a very understandable and graspable concept for the average person. So I think that was Piketty's main.
But also he showed how that's changed in the 20th century, as you say.
He has his huge. In the era of Keynesian, what I call managed capitalism, in the post-war era, we had unprecedented decline in inequality, sort of this is in the developed world, shared prosperity. And that was what I grew up in. I'm a product of that. I came up for the British welfare state, free education, scholarship boy, etc. That's, to me, is still the sort of model of managed capitalism that I have in my head, and that I think we, have to try and get back to the 21st century. Piketty, in his second book, which you refer to, also pointed out the sort of ideological power of capitalism. And I think that people have forgotten that. As you said, it's not a value-free system at all. It's a very interesting question how you sort of tackle that and what the role of ideas is in history. Keynes, of course, thought that ideas were more important than anything else. Piketty seems to be going somewhat in that direction, his second book, which is actually very different to what he said in his first book, when he said that there are sort of these inexorable laws of capital. And when he had his famous equation or inequality that when R is greater than G, i.e., when the rate of return on capital profit rates rather than bigger than the growth rate, you inevitably get a rise in inequality. That seemed to me to be a very sort of profound insight and very, again, relatively easy to understand. So I still associate Piketty with those insights, but I think he was right, obviously, to point out that it's it is a sort of ideological battle here.
But what's interesting is that the thinkers on the right tend to imagine that they are non-ideological. They like to think they're terribly grown up and they're just seeing things how they are. You can't buck the market and all of those shibboleths that they have.
Well, I mean, I think you were right up to a point. I don't know because I don't live in the UK anymore and Europe. I'm not so sure on it, but I'll stand on my ground on the US. One of the fascinating things that's happened in the US over the last 10 years or so is that actually that traditional sort of the market works view associated with Ronald Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher is also being criticized from the right. Now, Trump himself, has not really got any economic theories, but is instinctually protectionist, is instinctively sort of in favor of sort of propping up, certain industries and squashing others. That's a very interventionist approach. And behind him, there are now these sort of new conservative, they call themselves conservative research institutes in Washington, like the American Compass, who reject the sort of Adam Smith model of the world and are coming up with a sort of managed capitalism from the right based on strict immigration controls, strict, high tariff walls, and some sort of industrial policy. So you're right. There's sort of association, with you can't buck the market. Mrs. Thatcher's famous quote: "There is no alternative." actually, what's fascinating is the people on the right are now questioning that. So
Yeah, but there's an interesting thing there as well. This is not an explicit theme of the book, but I think it is implicit, and that is that it's the capacity of the right wing to fund the think tanks, the journalists, or the journals, and university chairs and those things. It seems to me that while there is criticism from the right, the left is in disarray. The left, on the whole, doesn't have that critical mass of ability to develop theory that the right has, and always has had. In my way of saying, the wrong people have got the money, but that's
well, I think
that's just my outlook.
I mean, certainly in the US, I worked in Washington, of course. The things like the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, Cato Institute, are all funded by conservative billionaires, and it's certainly true that they've churned out sort of pro-free market stuff for decades, and it's been extremely influential. Now, the left has sort of tried to counter that, setting up its own institutes with rather less success, partly because, as you say, they just don't have the money there. So that's certainly true, and again goes back to a sort of traditional left-wing criticism that the political system is not independent of the financial system. Marx and Engels famously called the government the sort of executive committee of the bourgeoisie, and if you live in Washington for a certain amount of time, you would probably agree with them. Now, I don't think you can reduce all the left's problems to that, though. Speaking as a person who's on the centre left myself, I think there is a sort of crisis. The crisis on the left is partly political and partly media. That they really don't know how to deal with this sort of right-wing ecosystem which has grown up in the last 20 or 30 years, which is extremely powerful. And part of it is, just filter bubbles. In the US especially, most Trump voters they don't ever see things like the New York Times or the New Yorker. They have their own media which they follow, which gives a completely self-enclosed view of the world, and it's very difficult to get through to voters like that. So that's a political issue. But I think there also is a sort of more intellectual policy issue. What is the left or centre-left rival vision to the sort of Trumpian economic nationalism or to sort of Chinese state capitalism? Which is also a clear vision, and also to the degrowth movement on the extreme left, which is also a pretty clear vision. What is the sort of Keynesianism, you might call it, or managed capitalism for the 21st century? And I think that is the huge open question, and that's the question which parties like the Labour Party in the UK, the SPD in Germany, the Socialist Party in France are all struggling with, and they haven't come up with a sort of marketable message for the 21st century. And the second thing they're struggling with, of course, is decline of the labour movement. So much of the progressive reforms of the 20th century were a product of strong labour movements in Germany, France, the UK, even the US, and that just doesn't exist anymore. So that's another huge challenge to the sort of left and centre-left.
So the centre-left is in disarray, and yet I look at capitalism, and it looks to me to be in terminal crisis. It's failing to deal with climate change. It's failing to deal with these population movements. It's had the 2008 financial catastrophe that nearly sank the Western. I mean, it looks to me to be in terminal crisis. But then, as you've said, the last rites have been read in every age. I'm not right this time, am I? It's going to go.
Well, I just raised that question in the last time. I mean, if I'd have interviewed you before, I'd have used you. I mean, I used Wolfgang Streeck, the German sociologist, who in 2014 basically made the just same argument we've just made. There's so much going wrong. There's so many crises that surely this time it's all going to come tumbling down. And he may well be proved right, but he hasn't been proved right in the last 11 years. There is something. Capitalism is very malleable and has got amazing powers of recovery. So before when I was young, when I was in Oxford, and I was in the sort of, I guess, the Labour Party, and I used to think more along those lines. But having written about capitalism sort of close up for the last 40 years, it is a very powerful sort of system politically, ideologically, and also practically, because whenever it gets into serious trouble, the government steps in and rescues it. And that's what we saw in
But
2008.
with globalism, you know, the ability of nation states to rescue is diminished all the time.
Well, the ability of individual states to police the system has diminished massively. That is one of the huge problems, obviously, globalization and sort of freedom of capital. Capital can move around the world a lot more easily than labor can, even though there's a lot of migration now, but it looks like that's going to be squashed. Even the Britain seems to be introducing more restrictive labor laws. The US has already done that, so it looks like they were not going to get as much migration as we've had. But capital is still basically free to go wherever it wants. So if one country puts up the tax system, the money moves somewhere else. That is a huge problem. And again, the problem facing the centre left, or the left, whatever you want to call it, in the 21st century is how do you get around that? The only real way to do it is having global cooperation, but that's so.
Good luck with
you
that.
laugh at it. I mean, the Biden administration did go to great efforts to sort of try and get this minimum global tax, but it hasn't made much of a dent. So you say, what's the alternative? There's got to be some way to mobilize support and opposition, and that is the great challenge. The right has done a great job of sort of mobilizing opposition to free migration or liberal migration laws. They don't have trouble doing that. Somehow the left has got to mobilize opposition to sort of free capital movements and sort of now with the sort of we haven't spoken about AI and the sort of internet tech economy. I think there's massive worries about that, and again widespread sort of public support for reining it in somehow. But again, the political system doesn't seem up to the task. Now, will that change when if we get massive job displacement of professional workers, like we got massive job displacement of manufacturing workers because of globalization? They call that the China shock in the US. If the AI shock is much bigger than the China shock, even as some people think it will be, will that radicalize the middle classes, professional middle classes, who start to see their jobs disappear? I think that's one of the big questions facing us in the next 10 or 20 years.
John, I have enjoyed this enormously, and I enjoyed the book very much as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was fun.
So that is John Cassidy, Capitalism and Its Critics, A Battle of Ideas in the Modern World. And I loved it to bits. Remember to subscribe to Books Podcast if you haven't yet. We're having something a little unusual next time. We'll be meeting comics legend Peter Hogan to talk about his series of graphic novels Resident Alien, which were later adapted into a TV show. So I hope to see you then.
That was the Books Podcast, presented by Tim Haig. Email Tim on tim@bookspodcast.com, Twitter @bookspodcast, and Facebook @bookspodcasttim.
Oh, thank you, John. We rattled through some
That was
stuff
great.
there,
That
didn't
was
we?
the best interview I've done. It was great.
Oh, thank you.
You actually read, most
I
people
read
don't
the
bother
book,
reading
yes.
about it.
I say, when you're talking about AI, we could have done another 10 minutes
Yeah, you
on,
could do.
the
Yeah.
Luddites
Yeah.
and the what's going to happen with...
No, you can do any. I mean, there's the thing. They're all such huge. That's the thing about his book. It's sort of 28 books in one, really. Each chapter raises a big